Barack Obama recently announced an initiative to basically provide more support for boys and for young men, which I thought was really interesting, right? And part of kind of how he framed it is that, look, as a society, we've done a lot to kind of give girls and young women, equal opportunities in all various parts of society, in the workplace, elsewhere, right? He's like, I'm not sure that we've done the same for boys, and the kind of the standard line, especially let's say on, left of center conversations, right, is that, well, men have plenty of privilege, right? And what what
Yeah.
is what is sometimes people don't even really understand the exact complaint, that is coming from some men, right? And so it's interesting to see, Barack Obama, such a prominent voice, right, in left of center politics, right, kind of make a case for young men. And then there's statistics. What are men struggling with? The statistics paint a very, very grim picture. One of the statistics that startles me, for instance, is that three quarters, and we can fact check this, right? But something like three quarters of suicides globally are by men.
Speaking of coping, what do you think men are struggling with most right now?
Yes. Well, there's no single answer, of course, right? And
Because
right, it's become such a topic of conversation recently. I don't know if you saw, but Barack Obama recently announced an initiative to basically provide more support for boys and for young men, which I thought was really interesting, right? And part of kind of how he framed it is that, look, as a society, we've done a lot to kind of give girls and young women, equal opportunities in all various parts of society, in the workplace, elsewhere, right? He's like, I'm not sure that we've done the same for boys, and the kind of the standard line, especially let's say on, left of center conversations, right, is that, well, men have plenty of privilege, right? And what what
yeah,
is what is sometimes people don't even really understand the exact complaint, that is coming from
yeah,
some men, right? And so it was interesting to see, Barack Obama, such a prominent voice, right, in left of center politics, right, kind of make a case for young men. And then there's statistics. What are men struggling with? The statistics paint a very, very grim picture. One of the statistics that startles me, for instance, is that three quarters, and we can fact check this, right? But something like three quarters of suicides globally are by men. Suicide is not,
wow,
at parity, right?
yeah, yeah,
And there is statistics in education. Men are falling behind, right? So that's one, I think, perspective on it, right? Some of the other conversations that I see around, the challenges that men face, and I think part of this conversation is there's the challenges, right, that they face, and then there's sort of like who and how are people showing up for those challenges, right? And we can get to that in a second, right? But some of the challenges that I see men face is, for instance, around processing certain emotions, right? Um, Processing, for
yeah,
instance, anger, processing aggression, processing shame. So those are, I would say, like the top ones, right?
yeah.
And processing anger, shame, and aggression. And so the conversation to me is interesting because advocates for providing this kind of support to men will say things like, well, yeah, men are not equipped, right? The way that men and boys
Yes.
are raised which is in a kind of, kind of an emotionally removed kind of way, basically doesn't give them the tools to, to recognize those emotions and then to do something with
Yeah.
them in some kind of a, um, healthy, contained way, right? And
Yeah.
kind
Yeah.
of the feminist argument, which I think, is in many ways very accurate, is that because there is a lack of kind of, we don't equip men and boys to, for instance, recognize when aggression is coming up, that then aggression comes out in very harmful ways, right? Yeah, often as domestic violence, right? And we see it in other spheres of life also, on the global political stage, uh, titled aggression, right? Most
Yeah.
of the wars, of the
Yeah.
conflict that we see in the world perpetuated by men, right? Yeah. And
Men.
it's
Yeah.
funny to even say it because it's so obvious, right? Um,
Yeah.
but it's a very, to me, clear gender disparity in terms of which
Yeah.
sex does which kind of work in the world, right? Um, and so we can
Yeah.
recognize that and at the same time recognize that there's also men are, incarcerated at very, very, high rate. Men are sent to war at a very, very, very high rate. And so there's then this kind of other story, this narrative around, well, it's these cycles of aggression and violence and shame that are in many ways bigger than any individual. If you grew up in a
Yeah.
home where, okay, let's say the father, was abusive, and I want to be careful with this conversation for your listeners, if these are sensitive topics, please, I invite your listeners to take the care that you need, right? But if you grew up in a home with a violence, right? Of course, right? And rush to save and to make secure the people in that home, right? To me, there is no sort of gray area there. I think then there is also, well, what does holding that person accountable look like? And sometimes I hear the conversation, well, this line maybe you've heard, hurt people, meaning that, right, that if you
Hurt.
were somehow hurt in the past, that just makes it more likely that you yourself are going to show up in violent ways. I think that's sometimes true. I think we can again look to so many hurt women who manage
Yeah.
somehow to not show up and perpetuate violence, right? So maybe the more accurate thing to say is
Yeah.
hurt men, right? Let's not make it universal.
Yeah. Yeah.
But even
Yeah.
then, what is the kind of the conversation that we need to have with those individuals, right? Currently, sometimes there's punishment. Sometimes, our criminal justice systems tend to be very lenient to domestic violence and to sexual violence. But, all of that, like what happens in the kind of criminal justice space, to me, is in many ways kind of removed and doesn't really address some of the deeper things, right? Yeah, and so if his father, for instance, was a war veteran and came home with very, very serious traumatic stress, and who knows the life that that father's father had, right? Where that was the
Yeah.
option, is to
Yeah.
go
Yeah.
into military service, right? I think we start to understand that this is the men's inability to process their emotions is bigger than any particular individual, right? And then there's that question I mentioned earlier. Well, then kind of whose job is it to address this,
Yeah.
right? And to me, the kind of
Yeah.
obvious answer is, well, it's the men's job. It's the individuals, right? To some
Yeah.
extent, who need
Yeah.
to take ownership, that word again, right? And and move towards healing, right? Um, I think the answer that we get sometimes instead of this one is, well, we as a society need to start providing services. I think that's also true.
Yeah.
But as I've seen with coaching
Yeah.
and as I've seen with my consulting work, right? You can bring the services to the people, to the individuals. But what then needs to happen is that
Yeah.
that individual needs to step into services or support or
Yeah.
whatever the modality is, or coaching for that matter, right?
Yeah.
What often
Yeah.
happens, and I
Yeah.
think this is a little bit, another challenge that men face, is that we struggle to ask for help, right? And we are very, very, I think,
Yeah.
fixated. And again, I think kind of the way that society defines men as very self-sufficient, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
When help is even presented to us, right? We say, I'm fine, I got this, right? And and
Yeah.
what
Yeah.
happened, and I've
Yeah.
been in those conversations. Like there's a book club I started with some folks in my community because I saw that the conversations around masculinity in I saw as very, very
Yeah.
narrow, right? Well, yeah,
And outdated.
outdated, and we just have such limited ideas of what a man can be, right? And it's like, right, what are kind of our
Yeah.
role models that we have available to us in Western society for a successful man, right?
Yeah.
Athlete, right? Usually one who is like very much in their aggression, right? Right,
Yeah.
exactly.
Macho types.
Or
Yeah.
sometimes like executives, right? Right? And again,
Yeah.
the ethical kind of
Yeah.
principles for that archetype are very similar, right? Power over, right?
Yeah.
Aggression, me, me.
Yeah.
And so those models, I think, serve men poorly. And so I was like, maybe there's a conversation that I can hold space for with men that just helps us to just even recognize and identify some other archetypes, models of masculinity
Yeah.
that show us that you can be kind and be a man, that you can care about nature and the environment and be a
Yeah.
man, right? That
Yeah.
that you can be connected to
Yeah.
your femininity and still be a man, right? And
Femininity.
so
Yeah.
so many other ways of being a man, right? And so I put together
Yeah.
a book club and I and
Yeah.
I offered it to some people in my community, right? Framing it kind of in these terms, right? Because often when we would have the conversation, what do you guys think it
Yeah.
means to be a man? They would say protector.
Yeah. Yeah, protector. Protector, and there is one more word. The one, that help in reproducing. What's that helps in
Yes.
making
Okay.
children.
It's not
There's a
coming to
term
me.
for it.
But if you think of it, yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, this has come from a very famous marketing
Uh-huh. Okay.
professor. Very
Yeah, if you
famous. Yeah, reproduce. I
sure.
think he said reproduce. Yeah,
Sure, exactly.
protect
Right.
and
You
reproduce.
know,
Something
and
like
it
that.
reminds me of
Yeah.
just the one mention of Trump here, but it reminds me exactly of that line during his campaign when he said something like, I'm the one who's going to protect the women whether they like it or not,
Okay.
right? And so for a lot of women who hear protector, what they actually
Yeah, they
understand is control, right? Right. And look,
controlling.
I
Yeah.
think that like protection is a whole other topic, and I think that there's a lot of need for real, true keeping us safe, right? And I see
Yeah.
the men who show up to that work in integrity, how deeply fulfilling they find that work. So but protector is just one way to be, right? Like if I'm a firefighter, right? Which is the kind of right, this protector role, and I come home to my wife and my children, is that the only way that I am going to show up, right? Like if my daughter wants to
Yeah.
play and it's totally safe, maybe there's some other ways that I can be with her, you know? maybe, yeah, maybe explorer, maybe teacher, right? Somehow it doesn't occur to men that they could be
Yeah.
kind teachers, which of course they can, right? So anyway, I offered
Like
this book
teachers.
club kind of as a way to just explore our understanding of all the different ways that men can show up. And I offered it to, some people in my community, mostly trying to attract men into this conversation. I get like five or so signups, and I look on the signups. Out of six people, four were women
Yeah.
and two
Okay.
were men. And the
For
men
women.
who showed up
Wow.
were like just the kindest, most sensitive, the most beautiful, caring men, right? And so to me, and one of the men who showed up is a little bit older and he has been doing like all kinds of men's work for many years, men's outreach, and kind of in a side conversation with me, he said, Misha, because I made a joke. I was like, isn't it funny? This is like a men's reading group or whatever, right? That it's all women.
Yeah.
And he's like, Misha,
Yeah.
this is typical that the people who mostly show up for men's work are women who are
Yeah.
trying to, I think, help the men in their lives and are seeing that the men themselves aren't
Yes.
showing
Yeah.
up for that work.
Showing
And
up.
so that's
Yeah.
where then the conversation of like, we need to be helping men gets a little bit like complicated for me, right? Because
Yeah.
when are the men going to start showing up for that work themselves? And the nice thing that I see now is
For that.
that some men are showing up for that work. It is now more typical,
Are showing
for
up.
instance, to see coaches who are specifically focused on I show up and I support men. And the men that are showing up to that work are the men who are saying, I'm ready for change. I know it's hard, but I know it's okay to ask
Yeah.
for help. I know that I can be a better father. I know that I can be a better leader, right? I know that I can be in community in a much more communal, collective kind of way. How do I do that? Right. And so that work is very, very exciting
Yeah.
to me. And, it's been really touching in my own work to see men start to come to me also, right? And especially for myself, I present and feel very at home in my genderqueer identity, and so part of that is, I wouldn't say distance, but at one point that is what it felt like for me is taking a little bit of distance from these more
Yeah.
traditional, conventional ways of masculinity. Now I'm finding myself, you know, I think finding a different kind of balance and you know, taking ownership, as we keep saying, of my own masculinity in some ways. And so it's been very, very healing for me to then see men now start to come to me and ask me questions like, Misha, how are you doing this? How are you able to be so authentic and be so present
Yeah.
and be so caring and so kind, Misha, I don't say this to everyone, but to you, I feel safe saying this. I want to be
Yeah.
kinder. I want to be less triggered,
Yeah.
less aggressive, And so I welcome that,
Yeah.
and to the men who are listening to this and watching, please reach out. I know the kinds of challenges the guys are going through. And I'm very, very motivated to support that work. So if you're at that place where you're asking the kinds of questions that me and Akanksha have been talking about, please reach out. I'm it would be an honor to hold space for that work as you're ready for it. Yeah.
Sounds beautiful. Sounds beautiful. So you mentioned that you hold this book club where the idea is basically, men should come and basically talk about, what is going on in their lives because it is very rare men opening up. So, emotional openness. Why is it still so hard for many men? Because you just said that five people turned up, out of which three were women.
Why? Well, I think, it's a very, very deep question, right? I mean, there's a few things. One is shame. I mean, we do this to ourselves in a way. right? Yeah, expression of emotion, right? Children do this easily, right? Children have no trouble expressing emotion
Yeah.
of either gender.
Yeah.
Expressing emotion is very, very human, right? And what happens, and I think, I do see that there's some change and some growth. I even see some people in kind of the men's workspace even challenging this idea that men are kind of emotionally repressed, right? And you know, personal experience, I think that that is true so often, right? But what I also see, there was a media moment recently. I think a soccer player was people, in the stadium were chanting very offensive things about his mother. And yeah, and he got very emotional and he began crying. And at the post game press conference, continued to be very, very emotional, right? And the emotion was sadness. He was very, very saddened by the fact that, I mean, can you imagine a crowd of whatever, thousands of people, right? Saying,
Yeah.
yeah. And so, we may like from a kind of conventional picture of how men would react to that, right? We would expect that athlete to either not react and just ignore that it's happening, right? Or maybe to lash out in some kind of anger or something like that, right? This man,
Yeah.
publicly visible man, right, felt very safe to show how he felt, right? And how he felt was bad, was sad, right? And so I mean, I only bring that example up to say that I do think that those attitudes are changing, right? And not just about men, but within men themselves. Um, right? I think as a whole, and I think especially outside of, locations and culture and geography, right? What you said earlier, machismo culture is still very much kind of the dominant, yeah, ideology, right? That men are only
You're
to
right.
have basically kind of two emotions, right? Anger
Yeah.
and aggression, which is just a more exaggerated version of
Aggressive.
anger, right?
Yeah.
And so as a young child, if you're expressing something that's not that, to your question, why, um, the older men who are
Yeah.
themselves, I'll use this word, kind of victims to that ideology, right? They see the young boy
Yeah.
who is expressing, let's say, sadness, right? And so those adult men, they remember when they were
Yeah.
children and they expressed sadness
Yeah.
and what they were told. Don't do
Yeah.
that because you will be perceived as weak. People will take advantage of your sadness and will punish you for it, right?
Yeah.
So that's a lesson that's very, very deep for a lot of men, and they pass that
Yeah.
lesson on.
Yeah.
Often out of, I think, kind of a concern for the young boy's safety, right? And the other thing
Yeah.
I'll add to the question of why, it's not only men who do this to young
Yeah.
boys. Women do this
Yeah.
too.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Um,
True.
and there was a story, maybe you know the writer Renee Brown. She's she's kind of like I mean, she's very well known, and she talks a lot about our emotions. She's a very popular speaker. She has a book called Atlas of the Heart, so many other books. And there's a story. She was doing
Yeah.
a book signing,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
a married couple comes up, a man and a woman, and basically what happens is the woman, the wife kind of walks away. And the man asks the Renee Brown, the author, to basically he tells her how much her work has meant to him for his own healing and for his
Yeah.
own kind of emotional self-awareness and emotional awakening, right? And she says something like, well, what is the conversation like with your wife? And the man tells the author that he cannot show his emotions to his wife because his wife then will think less of him.
Wow.
Because the
Less
wife,
of him. Wow. Yeah, yeah, that's
exactly, right?
very
Because
sad.
for her, she needs her man to be stoic, to be stable, to be without emotions, to be, right, as we say, the knight on the white horse,
Oh, yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah, yeah,
And so that's, I think, a big part of it. I mean, yes, there's the way that we as men kind of police and control and punish and repress each other. Women
yeah,
do this too, you know? And so I think, right, as part of how do we heal, fix, help men grow and evolve,
yeah,
there is a place for women in that
yeah,
work. I say that carefully because sometimes when I say
yeah,
that, the answer I get from women is, we've done enough. And, you know,
yeah,
if that's where you are as an
yeah,
individual in we've done enough, then take the space that you need,
yeah,
right? Of course, by all
mm,
means.
yeah,
But I think at the same time, we have to recognize that the narrow cages that we sometimes put men in are not only built by men, but are
yeah,
sometimes built by women and are sometimes built by
yeah,
mothers.
yeah, yeah.
Yes.
My mother. Actually, I kind of agree because a lot of time when we ask women what kind of life partner they would want, rather than saying that they want somebody caring, nurturing, answer most of the time is always protective provider, somebody who can basically fight with anybody. I think I 100% agree with what you just said, that men are not the only gender who are responsible for them not being basically opening up to their emotions somewhere somehow. Women and mothers are responsible too, because 8 out of 10 times when you ask women what kind of partner or husband or boyfriend they would want for themselves, the answer is always he has to be protective, he has to be the provider. It's very rare that they say he has to be nurturing, he has to be this nurturing, caring, or somebody who cares deeply. Yeah, so even the idea, I think both genders need to work work on it, like you said, this narrow mindset, because we do not realize it, but when we say that, hey, we would want boyfriend our boyfriends to be this protective masculine type of guy, we are also sending a message. There are thousands of young men who are listening to this, and they are, yeah, okay, so for you, what does healthy masculinity look like to you today
Yeah. Thank you.
as a
Yeah.
coach?
Reflecting on that very important question. Well, I mean, I think what we've been talking about, which is a mature self-awareness of the kind of inner emotional world, to me is the
Yeah,
biggest, I don't want to say gap, right? But where just so many men I see have a lot of room for growth. Yeah, like sometimes I've also been seeing recently, for instance, men are, the statistics of how much men are in therapy. It's relatively low rates, right? And, one of the kind of sometimes reasons that I see as cited for that, it's because, well, most therapists are women and
yeah,
most women therapists, approach mental health work through the lens of emotional awareness, right? And the response that's some men who I guess are resistant to building emotional awareness is that, well, men's brains are just have a lot less capacity for processing emotions. So, right? And so if we want therapy to be effective, we need to stop asking men how they feel and basically engage them in
yeah,
ways that are more masculine. And so what is
yeah,
that? Like, camping retreats where we're building bonfires and athletics and stuff. I mean,
yeah,
I love building bonfires and I love athletics also, but I don't buy that as men, because our brains are what, more primed for hunting or something, that we can't
Yeah.
develop emotional maturity. Oh, and again, people could
Yeah.
cite some kind of biological differences. That way of thinking to me, I think, is very disappointing, right? Because we see men,
Yeah.
people who are born in men's bodies display plenty of emotional maturity. And so I think I mean, even before kind of what we were talking about earlier, before the growth, there needs to be a little bit of coping. Just because you're able to be kind doesn't make you less of a man, right? And sometimes we
Yeah.
see things that way, and the men get very scared that they will be perceived in a feminine way, right? Because they showed up in
Feminine.
care. And so I think, so to your question, there is a really, I think, important piece of work, both inner work and also just in terms of the kind of role models that we have available to us around, yeah, normalizing emotional awareness as a masculine trait, right? The other thing in terms of healthy masculinity, I think is, a little bit of an evolution for what healthy romantic relationships look like.
Look like, yeah.
Yeah. It's interesting, right? So I'm in a lot of LGBTQ queer spaces, and now I'm really really encouraged by the fact that we see trans men and who are publicly visible, right? I recall on one of your episodes, actually, you had a really interesting conversation. Yeah,
Yeah.
right. And so, I think that there is so much that we can learn as men, as people who are somehow invested in masculinity, right? There's so much we can learn from trans men, right? And, I
Yeah.
think the kind of temptation for those of us who are kind of really holding on to old models is to kind of dismiss trans
Yeah.
men. I mean, there's so many ways that we dismiss trans men as a society, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So the call here is to not just accept, but to really learn, right? Because there we are seeing a very different way, right? And I absolutely, know that trans men are men, but they're coming to it, and I'll say this as someone who identifies in a trans feminine way, right? Women come to me sometimes with,
Yeah.
right,
Yeah.
Misha,
Yeah.
you're
Yeah.
doing femininity, I mean, first of all, in your very own way, but in a much more, and this isn't
Yeah.
about me, this is I see how people are kind of things open up for women. Misha, you're bringing so much courage to the way that you show up in feminine ways,
Yeah.
right? And of course, that feels good to
Yeah.
hear.
Yeah. Yeah.
But also, I don't carry with me the decades of misogyny and
Yeah.
harassment, right? As someone who came out
Yeah.
relatively recently, right? And so my ideas of femininity, are coming from a place of security, in some respects, right? Now
Yeah.
with trans men,
Yeah.
and of course again, I don't want to generalize and people come from different experiences, right? But you have folks who are kind of stepping into masculinity often later in life, often as adults, often with a lot of lived experience um, as girls, as women, right? And I think are bringing so much to learn for the rest of people who consider themselves men into the whatever the experience, the idea of that
Yeah.
gender. And so some of those things, I mean, we've talked about kindness, we've talked about nurture. There is also humor, right? There is play, right? There is, I think, again, a kind of let's do it together, right? There is a
Yeah.
let's talk about it. Men hate talking about it, right?
Yeah.
And so to
Yeah.
me, all of those things are
Yeah.
are
True.
are, are healthy masculinity. And the fact that we see this in trans men, I think shouldn't make us think that, people who are born as men aren't capable of this. Exactly the opposite, you know?
Yeah.
Let's look at gay
Yeah.
men, cisgender gay men, they have no problem showing up in very, very
Yeah.
social, whatever we can call it, like, yeah, just sociable ways, right? Where it's okay to express an emotion and it's okay to receive each other in the emotion. It's okay to then do something else with that emotion, right? So I think, yeah, straight men have a lot to learn from gay men as well in terms of um, how connected to our emotions we are, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
So some examples, yeah, healthy masculinity.
Nice. So, have you, as a coach, have you had male clients show up with one goal but discover another deeper truth, while, being in coaching
Yeah.
with you?
Yeah.
And has it ever happened? Yeah, I'm sure, it must have, happened, with so many clients, but, something like, more
Yeah.
profound.
We call it a shift in the work.
Yeah.
That kind of shift, people really have to be open to it. And to be open to it,
Yes.
the client has to be in a really, they have to feel safe and they really have to trust the process, right? And so I only set
Trust the
that up a little
process.
bit to say that it takes some time in a client working relationship to get there. What people come with are these like very kind of concrete material goals, right? Few people come and
Yeah.
say, "Hey, I want a different life." What they're asking
Yeah.
for is some very concrete piece. I want a new job, or I want to make more money, or um, things like that, right? Uh, as a coach, I it is part of now the kind of the craft, the art of this work for me to, on the one hand, receive and validate that goal and that ambition, right? Yes, let's figure out how to get you to the job that you think you need, right? But part of the work that I'm doing
Yeah.
is also, I think, trying to kind of understand, well, where is that tendency, that movement coming from, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And right, so there's my kind of own work that I'm doing just in terms of seeing the person really accurately, right? Um,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
then
Yeah.
there is, how do I support the client that I'm working with in seeing that there's something behind the goal that they brought to me, right?
Yeah.
And not
Yeah.
everybody's receptive to that.
Yeah.
And not even if people are okay to recognize that, I'm trying to refocus my camera.
Yeah.
If they are okay with recognizing that, sometimes the kind of the challenge well, I thought I wanted a new job, but actually what I want is a new life, right? Or a new, I want to actually
Yeah.
work for myself because my time is really important to me and being able to make my own decisions is really important to me, right? That's different. That
Yeah.
becomes a different kind of project, right? And so, I'm trying to kind of to think. Um, I'll give you one example. Let's see if I can refocus my camera first before I keep going. I'm blurry a little bit, right? Okay, better. Now it's better. Now it's better. Yeah. I had a client. We were doing kind of like a big intake workshop, where let's talk about all the different parts of the life where, you would like to see as some kind of an improvement, some kind of a shift, some kind of a growth. And one of the things that she offered and brought to the space was that she had some insecurities around her body, right? Which is so common,
Yeah.
And yeah, and she was like, I could do more exercise, I want to lose some weight. And so, of course we receive, and this was going to be kind of be one of our projects. How do we, help her step into some some work to I think, I mean, the way that I would support this client is to find some self-acceptance, right? And then let's develop an idea of what healthy growth looks like, right? Um, so anyway, that's
It
like
looks like,
what the
yeah.
client presents. In a following workshop, a session, sometimes I do this with clients. We kind of do a visualized meditation, right? Um, some of the tools that yeah, some of the tools that I
Visualize.
use with folks, I mean, I draw from some different disciplines, and visualization and meditation is a part of it. And so this meditation was, and I wasn't thinking about, the thing that she said about perception of her body, because she brought a lot of other things about her job and about, is she living in the right city and so on. And so with all of that kind of on the table, I said, let's do this visualized meditation. And the meditation basically guides the participant to connect with kind of your like an animal guide, to see yourself
Yeah.
as some kind of an animal creature that feels resonant for you, right? And I kind of take folks through, a series of visualizations to then see themselves as, some kind of a creature or an
Yeah.
animal or a bird or, an insect, whatever suddenly comes to them, right? And then to explore what it's like to be this non-human form, and then when we kind of come back from the meditation, we reflect on what that was like, and on what we can learn, right, from sort of the
Yeah.
rest of the animal world.
Yeah.
And so with this person, right, the meditation is guided where she is just herself processing and is having the experience. And then we close and we're kind of back in shared space. And I say, so how was it for you? What animal came to you? And she said, I found myself
Yeah.
as this very large, massive bear. And I said, and how was that? She
Wow.
said, it felt incredible. I felt like I was in my power. I felt like,
Yeah.
I was just moving slowly but deliberately, right? Right? And,
Deliberately.
we like part of the conversation was absolutely about how this animal, large, right, doesn't, they are not ashamed of that, right? They are not